Census records are a popular genealogy resource, but are you familiar with the mortality schedules that accompanied them? I briefly mentioned mortality schedules as an alternate record in an overview of death records, but now I want to go into more detail about these records specifically. So what are they and how can they be used in your research? Put simply, mortality schedules are lists of people who died in the 12 months leading up to the census enumeration date of that year. So these lists in particular were created as an addition to the United States federal census every 10 years from 1850 to 1900. Of course, the majority of the 1890 census was famously destroyed by a fire and is no longer available, and only a portion of the 1900 mortality schedules survived after they were ordered to be destroyed, but I'll get to that later. Now, although these schedules serve as nationwide death registers, these records are limited in scope, considering they only cover the 12 months leading up to the census enumeration date. However, they are a great resource for locating information on people who died before statewide death registration began, since they often predate the earliest recorded death records for a given state. So how can these schedules be useful in your research? Mortality schedules can be used to supplement missing records. In some cases, birth, marriage, or death records may be unavailable or difficult to locate. Because mortality schedules were being recorded before many states were required to keep civil death records, it could be the only record of death that exists for an ancestor in the absence of a gravestone or cemetery records. Even if a tombstone does exist, it likely won't detail the cause of death, if their parents were foreign born, or their occupation, for example. So don't write these mortality schedules off too quickly, because they can provide important details that you might not find elsewhere. They can also be used to identify, infer, or confirm family members. By cross-referencing the information found in a mortality schedule with the population schedule, you can identify family members both living and deceased, and possibly uncover hidden branches of your family tree. Mortality schedules also included infant mortality, so in this case, if a child died too young before they could be enumerated in the census, then the mortality schedule may have been the only record of their death if they didn't have a tombstone. It's also not uncommon to find multiple members listed together on a mortality schedule, especially if a prominent disease in the community had affected the household. Identifying a potential parent and child together on the schedule could lead you to the spouse and other living children or family members living in the household that reported the death when cross-referenced with the population schedule. So I'll show you how to do that a little bit later. Mortality schedules also help us understand the health and medical history of our ancestors. The causes of death listed in mortality schedules can provide insights into prevalent diseases or health issues within a community during a specific time period. The information may shed light on possible genetic conditions or environmental factors that affected the family's health. They may help you locate burial places as well. If you locate your ancestor on a mortality schedule and you didn't already know the town where they died, you can then search local cemeteries in the area to see if they were buried there, possibly with other family members, allowing for further exploration and verification through cemetery records. Mortality schedules can also help track family migration patterns. By noting the location of death and comparing it with previous or subsequent census records, you can gain a better understanding of how families moved and settled over time. The record might even tell you how long your ancestor had been living in the area, helping you solidify a timeline for them. Uncommon or unusual causes of death listed in mortality schedules can spark further investigation. These causes may indicate accidents, epidemics, or other noteworthy events that impacted the community. You can then use these unusual tidbits of information to scour newspapers and see if anything had been reported on it at the time for even more detail and documentation. And lastly, you could uncover unique details about your ancestors. Since the cause of death listed might provide clues about their lifestyle or occupation, you might discover information about your ancestor that you can't find in any other available records. Overall, mortality schedules offer unique insights into the lives and deaths of our ancestors and can help create a more comprehensive and vivid picture of our family history. So let's first talk a little background before we delve into what information these schedules reveal and how to locate them. I mentioned earlier that mortality schedules are additions to the population schedule. The United States federal census is also known as a population schedule, and although these census records are massively popular in genealogy research, there are sister schedules, if you will, which are actually called non-population schedules or special schedules, are not as well known or utilized as the census. In fact, there are actually 8 non-population schedules that were created as additions to select censuses. So, aside from the mortality schedule, there are agricultural schedules, Indian population inquiries, manufacturing schedules, social statistics schedules, slave schedules, veteran schedules, and the dependent, defective, and delinquent classes schedule, commonly referred to as the DDD. I will be creating videos for these other 7 schedules, but for today, we are focusing strictly on the mortality schedules. The first United States Census was taken in 1790, so why did it take 60 years to start including a mortality schedule with the census? Well, Lemuel Shattuck, a Massachusetts legislator, visionary, ardent genealogist, and notably one of the founders of the New England Historic Genealogical Society, is credited with the idea of creating mortality schedules. He believed that this information was essential for understanding public health trends and developing effective public health policies. After authoring an analysis of the Bill of Mortality for the city of Boston in 1841, and then presenting a report that emphasized the importance of collecting vital statistics in 1842, Shattuck then designed the 1845 census of Boston, expanding the scope of information that was being collected at the time. Shattuck's efforts did not go unseen and would lead to his recruitment to the team that was developing the 1850 United States Federal Census, the first one that would include the mortality schedule. The primary motivations behind including this schedule with the census were public health and vital statistics, which were of growing interest in the mid-19th century. By collecting data on deaths and causes of death, policymakers and public health officials aimed to gain insights into mortality rates, disease patterns, and health conditions in different regions of the country. By recording the causes of death for individuals in various age groups and demographic categories, researchers could identify patterns and study disease prevalence along with the impact of diseases on communities. Also in the mid-1800s, communities were facing periodic outbreaks of infectious diseases, such as cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis. Mortality schedules helped authorities track and respond to disease outbreaks, guiding public health measures and resource allocation. By the 1900s, mortality schedules were discontinued for a variety of reasons. Aside from their limited scope, over time, individual states had begun to establish their own vital statistics registration systems for recording births and marriages and deaths, and they were seen as more efficient and comprehensive sources of mortality data. So by 1880, it was decided that the deal was the mortality schedules would no longer be mandatory for any city or state that adopted a standardized death certificate and had reached 90% compliance in recording said vital statistics. At the time in 1880, only 2 states qualified, Massachusetts, surprise, surprise, and New Jersey. By 1900, however, it had expanded to include 10 states along with many large cities, and by 1902, most states had implemented some form of vital records laws. It took some time for states to hammer all of this out, so it wasn't actually until 1933 that countrywide death statistics were considered reliable. So, what do these schedules look like? Let's take a look at one from 1850. This particular schedule is for the county of Lafayette in the state of Louisiana. Now, I mentioned earlier that these schedules list those who died in the year leading up to the date that the census was taken that year, meaning the enumerators were tasked with recording deaths that occurred within the 12 months prior to the official census enumeration date. The enumeration date for the 1850 through 1880 censuses was June 1st, so deaths recorded by this schedule occurred between June 1st of the preceding year and May 31st of the census year. Using 1850 as an example, it should theoretically encompass every death that took place in the nation from June 1st, 1849 to May 31st, 1850. I say theoretically because it's been estimated that only 60% of deaths were actually recorded in the mortality schedules of 1850. But over the years, that number was estimated to improve to under 20 to 40%. Again, these are estimates, but something to keep in mind. The amount of information recorded also improved over the years. Information gathered in 1850 and 1860 was very similar in that it included the name of the deceased, their age, sex, race, whether free or slave. So keep in mind that these records were pre-Civil War, and by 1870 this column did disappear, but these 1850 and 1860 records can be extremely valuable in identifying enslaved ancestors because once again, it may have been the only time that their death was ever officially recorded, or quite possibly the only place that their name, age, or place of birth was ever officially recorded. On the 1850 and 1860 schedules, we also see marital status, their place of birth, the month in which they died, their profession, occupation, or trade, the disease or cause of death, and the number of days they were ill. Be sure to look below at the bottom of the schedule for any remarks that were left by the enumerator. These remarks might provide more detail about an unusual death. They might indicate if the deceased and their family lived elsewhere, and if so, what town. Sometimes you'll see notes about the general health of the community and any diseases that might have affected them as a whole. Sometimes you'll find environmental descriptions like the quality of the water, what types of trees were in the area, things like that. I want to point out that when you're looking here at the month in which they died, remember that these schedules covered the year prior to enumeration. So for example, if you see August listed here like we do, we know that this is August 1849, since the dates covered for the 1850 census were June 1st, 1849 to May 31st, 1850. I also want to point out that the information provided for the mortality schedule was self-reported, in most cases by the families. This is similar to the way that some of the information provided on a death certificate is filled out by an informant who is also usually a family member. The main difference here is that not everyone who died in the 1800s had an attending physician there to certify what the actual cause of death was. So the cause of death may not have been entirely accurate, or more so based on symptoms. There could be errors, there may have been omissions, not to mention this was the 1800s and medical knowledge and technology wasn't what it is today. There were instructions for enumerators to try and do their best to follow up with physicians and take a look at their records and their logs, their notes, to try and confirm what they had learned for the mortality schedule. But like I said, not everybody had an attending physician. Once the 1870 census came along, 3 new columns of information were collected. You'll see this number here that says number of the family as given in the second column of Schedule 1, which is the population schedule. So this number indicates the household that reported the death, and with this number you can then cross-reference that information with the accompanying population schedule. Let me show you. With this first line here, we see the family number is 12 for Diana Brockway, and this tells us that she was indeed married. So let's see if we can find her husband in the population schedule. When I search the 1870 census for a Brockway living in Barnett, Caledonia, Vermont, I find 2 Brockways. We have R.E. Brockway, a 46-year-old farmer, and Charles R. Brockway, who was 16 years old and attending school. So with this information, we can infer that this R.E. fellow was likely Diana's husband and that Charles was possibly their son. We also see 2 others listed in the household, so those would also be people of interest that you would want to look into and learn more about their ties and their relationships with the Brockways. Now you see how with this information we can compare the household that reported the death with what you might already know to confirm if this is indeed your ancestor, which is particularly helpful if your ancestor had a more common name. So if you were already aware that Diana was married and you knew that she had a son and that his name was Charles, this right here would further prove that this was the Diana that you are researching. Or it's possible that you might discover the family of your deceased ancestor for the first time if you hadn't yet located them in that census or elsewhere. The other two columns that were added to the 1870 mortality schedule was a box to check whether the deceased's father was foreign born and another to check whether their mother was foreign born. Then we have the 1880 mortality schedule, which took it a step further and added columns that list the place of birth for the mother and father of the deceased, as opposed to just ticking a box indicating if they were foreign born. This column here is also a new addition, which asks how long a resident of the county. If less than a year, state months in fractions, which can be very useful in locating your ancestors in other towns and censuses. And if you look down here further down the page, you'll see an area where the enumerator would elaborate on anyone who died in that district, but their family resided outside of the area. Here we see that the family of the deceased listed on line 22 was from Kent, Litchfield, Connecticut, which is roughly 12 miles away from this district of Sherman where she died, which is why you'll notice up here on the corresponding line 22, there isn't a number for the family, and that's because they're not listed in the population schedule for that enumeration district. Instead, you'd need to search the population schedule for Kent to make that connection. This record is another great example of how these schedules can provide clues that will lead you further in your research and firm up your timeline, because if we take a closer look here at this entry, we see that both she and her parents were born in New York. Then, if we look over at this column, we see that although her family was recorded as residing in Kent, she had been living in Sherman for 25 years. So that gives you 2 more locations to search for that ancestor. It is possible that there's a duplicate entry for one person in the mortality schedule, so keep that in mind. If you do find that your ancestor is in the mortality schedule for the district that they died, but not where they resided, be sure to check out the mortality schedule for the town in which they actually resided as well. Lastly, we see a column that was added for the attending physician in 1880. There's some blank spaces here for those who didn't have one, or maybe the information was unknown. And then especially in a small town like this, you'll typically see the same physician's name or names appearing. This can be another research point to jump off from, because with the physician's name, you can research that individual. Maybe their physician's records have been digitized, and you can learn even more about the cause of death of an ancestor. If you want to learn more about locating hospital records, be sure to check out my last video detailing how to go about that. Before we move on to the 1900 mortality schedules and those lucky Minnesota records that managed to slip through the cracks and survive, we can't skip over the 1885 semi-decennial census. The federal government asked states to participate in this census and offered monetary compensation to those who did. Not many states actually did, and many of them had already reached statewide compliance for their vital statistics registration. However, Colorado, Florida, Nebraska, and the New Mexico and Dakota territories did participate. And it paid off in more ways than monetary compensation, because what makes these 1885 census records even more valuable is that 5 years later, that 1890 fire I mentioned took out pretty much all of the census records for that year, leaving a huge gap for researchers. So if you have any ancestors who were living in these parts during that time, then these are certainly worth looking at. Looking at an example of an 1885 mortality schedule, you'll notice that no new columns were added, and the same information was collected as was collected during the 1880 enumeration. How about those 1900 Minnesota mortality schedules that I mentioned? The destruction of the 1900 mortality schedules was authorized by a congressional act in 1902, and the vast majority of the schedules were destroyed. However, due to an administrative error, some of Minnesota's mortality schedules were not destroyed as planned, and years later, a copy was discovered at the Minnesota Historical Society. It's since been published, and I'll leave a link for that in the description below. It's believed that the oversight occurred when the Minnesota mortality schedule was mistakenly included with other census records or wasn't properly accounted for during the destruction process. As a result, it survived and was not disposed of as intended. So for those of you with Minnesota ancestors, that's definitely a score. Now that we've made it through those, let's talk about how to find them. Unfortunately, not all of these records have been digitized and placed in one centralized database. Wouldn't that be nice? So, as with most of these record searches, you'll first want to determine the date and location that you're looking for. So, the census year and the county, town, or enumeration district that you're seeking. Once you have that in mind, you can start figuring out where those particular records are held today. When mortality schedules were discontinued in the early 1900s, the Census Bureau offered the records back to their respective states, but not all states were interested in acquiring them. So for the states that did, you can check the state archive, the state library, or state historical society to determine where they're held today. For the records that weren't returned to their respective state, the National Archives took over some of the records as well. These records have been microfilmed and can be viewed at the National Archives building in Washington, D.C., and at some other regional facilities. You can search their microfilm catalog to find the facilities that house the particular microfilm publication you're searching for, and again, I'll leave that link below. Of course, the easiest route to search for these mortality schedules is to do it online. You'll find that certain genealogy websites have digitized mortality schedules, but they aren't complete collections. In order to determine whether the digitized collection you're interested in includes the location you want to search, you'll need to read more about the collection itself. Ancestry.com has a large database of mortality schedules online. You can see here that they have over 1 million records in their database for the United States Federal Census mortality schedules, along with the 1871 mortality schedules for Canada, and some for New York, Missouri specifically. This database here is for index only, so you won't find the record images here. For the record images, you'll want to go through this database. To figure out if Ancestry has the digitized records you're searching for, you would come over here on the right and click on the year that you're interested in, then select the state, followed by the county. That way, you'll see as you do these drop downs if they have what you're searching for. Depending on the census year and location, you might need to drill down a little bit further, and then from there you can browse the images like so. And of course, if you'd rather try searching the records by name, you can do that with this particular database here by using these here. As you're searching for the record availability of a census year and location, you might notice that the state that you want is listed, but the county or district that you are searching for in that state is not. Or maybe the entire state isn't available for that particular census year. So even though this collection has over 1 million records, it's still not complete and you may need to search elsewhere. Also, if you're using the free Ancestry account, the record images won't be available to you, but don't forget that if you don't have a paid Ancestry subscription, you can check out your local library and use their library edition, and then you can save, print, or email the records that you find from there. While you're at it, check out some of their other free options like Heritage Quest. You simply enter your library card number here, and then you'll be brought to this homepage where you can select mortality schedules and go from there. Speaking of free, FamilySearch.org also has digitized mortality schedules that you can search for free. Their options aren't as robust, but they're still helpful. And some of the other popular genealogy sites like MyHeritage and FindMyPast also have smaller collections for mortality schedules. There are other free genealogy websites like Cindy's List, where you narrow down from United States to the U.S. Census, and then down to mortality schedules. Here we have online records and indexes. You can look at what they have here. And then there's also general resources, which is also worth looking at. US Gen Web Archives is another worth checking out because they might have links or access to some information and indexes. And then if you go to mortalityschedules.com, you can browse their collections online. Some states or local libraries and historical societies have digitized or published their mortality schedules for the area that they cover. So definitely check out their websites for their online catalog or get in contact with them to see what they have, what's available, and where their records are held. Often they have microfilm or digital copies that are available. As you search, you might find that the records have been digitized but not indexed, meaning that you can't search them by name, so instead you'll need to browse by year and location. This might be more of a daunting task for the larger cities, but especially for those smaller cities that only consisted of maybe a few pages or so, browsing isn't as intimidating as it might sound. Plus, when you're using the browsing method, you might catch the names of other familiar individuals or surnames that you weren't looking for originally. And now for the bonus round, mortality schedules for state censuses, which were generally recorded in the years 1855, 1865, and 1875. These state censuses are often found at the state archive or state library, but as you can see here on mortality-schedules.com, under New York, looking at this collection, we see the 1865 and 1875 New York State Census mortality schedules are listed here. And then looking further into the 1865 records, we see that not only was the month of death recorded, but also the day that the person died, which we don't see on the federal census schedules that we were just looking at. So the next time you're analyzing census records in the mid to late 19th century, both federal and state, and you discover that a family member you were expecting to find with the rest of the family has gone missing, don't forget to check that mortality schedule to determine whether they died in the year leading up to that census. I'll continue covering these various alternate death records, so if that's something that interests you, then don't forget to check back here for more to come. And if you're someone who likes to transcribe records as you go, I'll drop links to blank mortality schedule forms below, and you can go ahead and use that. Happy researching!